Clint Eastwood is an undisputed icon of the Western genre, so much so that I've spent the past year attempting to document his incredible career with retrospectives of all of his American Westerns, from his lesser-known films like Mules For Sister Sara, all the way through to his unforgettable masterpieces like Unforgiven. So if you have an hour or so to kill and are interested in the behind-the-scenes story of how Clint Eastwood became a legend of the Western genre, then this compilation is for you. And it all kicks off in 1968 with Hang 'em High.
You a lawman or ain't you?
So Hang 'em High was written by Mel Goldberg and Leonard Freeman, who were both experienced TV writers, with the latter actually being the creator of the popular TV crime drama Hawaii Five-0. But despite this, neither writer had all that much experience writing movies, especially westerns, even though Leonard Freeman did previously appear in an episode of The Lone Ranger. Now, although Hang 'em High was largely a fictional movie, it did draw heavily on real historical themes and events from the Old West. For example, the character of Judge Fenton was actually based on a real-life judge called Isaac Parker, also known as the Hanging Judge, who sentenced 160 people to death, believing that strict law enforcement was the pathway to successful civilization. So by 1967, Clint Eastwood had rocketed to stardom thanks to his role as the man with no name in Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy. However, as a result, Eastwood spent much of his time dubbing for the English language versions of those movies, or doing endless interviews about them on the side, which left the actor feeling angry and frustrated. So when Sergio Leone flew out to LA to pitch him the role of harmonica in Once Upon a Time in the West, Clint Eastwood turned him down, uninterested in starring in yet another ensemble spaghetti western. But ultimately, the decision proved costly, as the movie ended up being a cinematic masterpiece, and is widely considered one of the greatest westerns ever made. Around this time, Clint Eastwood also turned down starring in another high-profile western called McKenna's Gold, featuring an all-star cast that included Gregory Peck, Omar Sharif, and Telly Savalas. And although the project might have initially seemed like a safe bet on paper, Eastwood was wise to pass on it, as the film ended up being a complete critical and commercial failure that might well have damaged his career. So Clint Eastwood clearly gave a lot of consideration to what film he should star in next, likely well aware that most people only really knew him for his role as the man with no name. For that reason, he was very wary of being typecast, but still wanted to take on a role in the same sort of tough guy mold that had made him so famous. That was why he was so impressed upon reading the script for Hang 'em High, as it was an American revisionist western that felt like a cross between Rawhide and a spaghetti western. He also liked that it had a similar plot to the Oxbow incident, which was one of his all-time favourite westerns. So Clint Eastwood ultimately agreed to star as the character of Jed Cooper, but under the condition that he also serve as a producer, granting him some level of supervision over every level of the production. So once Clint Eastwood agreed to star, he had a big say over the decision of who should direct the movie. And in the end, he opted to go with a director that he knew he could trust, and picked Sergio Leone. However, the Italian director was already deep in production on Once Upon a Time in the West, so he had no choice but to turn Eastwood down. So during the search for a director, the studio behind the film, United Artists, put together a long list of established directors that they felt would be a good fit, including Robert Aldrich and John Sturges. However, Clint Eastwood was adamant about finding a director that he knew he could trust, leading him to endorse Ted Post instead, a well-established TV director that he'd worked with in the past, having previously helmed over 20 episodes of Rawhide. But this was met with a lot of pushback, given that Post had very little experience directing feature films. However, Clint Eastwood used his considerable influence to force through the appointment. Now, when it came to casting, director Ted Post was keen to hire actors that he and Eastwood had already worked with in the past. So a lot of the actors from Rawhide were offered roles in the movie, including Pat Hingle, Ed Begley, and Charles McGraw. Another important casting to get right was the character of Rachel Warren, the customary love interest of the movie. So Ted Post decided to go with the relatively unknown television actress Inga Stevens, who was somewhat reluctant to work on the movie, given that she had no idea who Clint Eastwood was. This later proved ironic, as it was widely reported that the actress ended up having an affair with Eastwood during their time working on the movie. Hang 'Em High also featured some pretty big-name cameos of actors that would later go on to become huge stars. For instance, a young Bruce Dern makes an appearance ahead of his long career in the Western genre, in films such as The Cowboys, Wild Bill, Django Unchained, and The Hateful Eight. Dennis Hopper also has a minor role in the movie, months before filming his breakout role in Easy Rider. Another important element of the film to get right was its location, because although most of the interiors would be shot at MGM Studios, they still had to find somewhere to shoot that could pass for 1873 Oklahoma. So writer Leonard Freeman took a drive out to Las Cruces, New Mexico, in order to scout locations, and that same day managed to find the tree that was used for the hanging scene at the start of the movie, which nowadays is no longer standing. Likewise, the river next to it has since completely dried up, and is now overgrown with thick brush. An equally important element of the movie was its music, so they decided to go with composer Dominic Frontieri, who was reportedly given just 8 days to compose an Ennio Morricone-type score. Despite this, he did an excellent job, with the title theme even going on to become a top 10 hit for the group Booker T and the MGs. It also featured in a medley of spaghetti western music by the band Wall of Voodoo, and My Chemical Romance also referenced Hang 'Em High with a 2004 song of the same name. So once filming on the movie began, Clint Eastwood took a very active role in its production, especially with its script, often altering dialogue and other minor elements. For example, this scene was originally set in a saloon, but Eastwood had its setting changed to make it more believable. Equally, the fight scene with Bruce Dern was choreographed almost entirely by Eastwood. However, probably the most significant change he made to the script was the addition of an early scene in which Jed rescues a car from being swept away by the river. This is because Eastwood knew that he was going to spend the rest of the movie playing a vengeful, cold-blooded killer, so he felt that there needed to be a scene early on that established him as a hero and an innocent guy, making it clear from the outset that his character was a lot different to the self-serving anti-hero that he'd played in his last 3 movies. Now, Clint Eastwood wasn't the only one working on the movie who wanted to make changes to it during the shoot, because at one point its writer and producer Leonard Freeman appeared on set requesting all sorts of creative changes. This frustrated director Ted Post so much that he decided he needed to confront him. However, Clint Eastwood stopped him and said that he would go speak to the writer instead. And true to his word, Eastwood calmly walked over to Freeman and said, "If you come on this set again, we all walk." Following this, the writer was never seen on set again. Now, as much as Clint Eastwood viewed Hang 'Em High as a chance to branch out from his iconic role as the man with no name, the actor still managed to include a sneaky reference to the Dollars trilogy, because the holster that his character wears in those movies is identical to the one Jed wears in Hang 'Em High. So another reason why Hang 'Em High was so important for Clint Eastwood and his career was because it was the first movie out of his new production company titled Malpaso Productions, which he was able to set up with the money that he made from the Dollars trilogy. And the basic idea behind it was that it would give Eastwood a lot more leeway over the films that he was starring in, given that he'd also be producing them, which was the case with Hang 'Em High. And this arrangement suited Eastwood so much that Malpaso ended up serving as the production company for almost all of his movies moving forward, including his westerns. Now, Hang 'Em High was not without its controversy, because it was actually considered a pretty violent movie for its time, so much so that it earned the film an M rating in the US, and even had some of its more graphic scenes cut whenever it was broadcast on TV. So when Hang 'em High finally released in 1968, it was a big box office success, making $10.8 million on a budget of just $1.6 million. In fact, there was so much excitement for the film that it had a record-breaking first day, becoming the biggest opening for the studio in its history, exceeding all of the James Bond films that had released up to that point. It even earned more at the box office than any of the Dollars Trilogy films, as well as Once Upon a Time in the West. So Hang 'em High delivered Clint Eastwood quite the payday, as he reportedly signed onto the film for a salary of $400,000, as well as 25% of its net earnings. So following its record-breaking success, Hang 'em High went down pretty well with critics and audiences alike. For instance, Arthur Winston of the New York Post described it as a western of quality, courage, danger, and excitement. But not everyone was so complimentary, with Variety calling it a poor American-made imitation of a poor Italian-made imitation of an American-made Western. Nowadays, though, Hang 'em High is widely viewed as a solid, if not groundbreaking Clint Eastwood Western, that's unfortunately pretty overshadowed by his earlier and later work within the genre, which all proved to be far more memorable in the long run. Now, even though Hang 'em High didn't quite have the legacy that Clint Eastwood might have hoped, it still proved to be a significant film in his career. For instance, his turn as an intense, morally ambiguous law enforcer very much feels like a precursor to his role as Dirty Harry 3 years later, and likely had a big influence on that casting. And more importantly, the success of Hang 'em High proved that audiences were willing to watch Clint Eastwood in a Western even if he wasn't playing the man with no name, a reality that Eastwood made the most of moving forward, starring in another Western just 2 years later called Two Mules for Sister Sara.
Sister, I don't mind shooting them for you, but I'll be damned if I'm gonna sweat over them for you.
You're as stubborn as my mule, you know.
Horse.
So Two Mules for Sister Sara was actually originally written by Bud Bowditcher, an American director best known for his highly acclaimed low-budget westerns that often starred Randolph Scott. And apparently, the director initially planned for Two Mules for Sister Sara to star Robert Mitchum and Deborah Kerr, in a plot that follows a female Mexican aristocrat who enlists the help of a capable cowboy to escort her to the United States, in hopes of escaping the vengeance of the Mexican Revolution. So given that he wrote the script and was a long-term resident of Mexico, Bud Bowditcher was very keen to direct the movie himself, and eventually sold the screenplay with the provision that he would be the one to direct it. But unfortunately, this never came to pass. So the original screenplay that Bud Bowditcher wrote ended up being sold to producer Martin Rakin, who opted to remove the director from the project altogether, and hire Albert Maltz to rewrite his script. Now at the time, this might have seemed like a strange move, given that Bowditcher was one of the most well-regarded directors in the genre, having previously helmed films like The Tall T and Ride Lonesome. But it's believed that the reason for this move was because Rakin wanted to tap into the growing popularity of spaghetti westerns. So the story was ultimately reworked to feature a mysterious cigar-smoking gunslinger who comes to the rescue of a prostitute posing as a nun during the French intervention in Mexico. And although Two Mules for Sister Sara ended up being a lot less crude and cynical than other spaghetti westerns of that time, it was clearly heavily inspired by the work of Sergio Leone, and as a result ended up being far removed from the kind of western that Bud Bowditcher first set out to make. So with the whole film now going in a very different direction, Two Mules for Sister Sara was in need of a new director that would be capable of capturing the spaghetti western style that its producer was so keen on emulating. So they decided to go with Don Siegel, who had just directed the 1969 western Death of a Gunfighter, and perhaps more importantly, Coogan's Bluff, starring Clint Eastwood, who had developed a strong working relationship with the director while working on the movie. Now, as perfect of a casting as Clint Eastwood was for the character of Hogan, he wasn't actually directly approached about the role. Instead, Eastwood first found out about the movie from actress Elizabeth Taylor, while working on the 1968 war movie Where Eagles Dare. This was because Taylor had already been cast as Sister Sara, and showed Eastwood the script in the hope that they might be able to work together. And this was very nearly the case, but when Elizabeth Taylor heard that the movie was set to be shot in Mexico rather than Spain like she expected, the actress dropped out. So in the end, the role of Sister Sara was eventually filled by Shirley MacLaine, an American actress famous for her Oscar-nominated performances in The Apartment and Some Come Running. Now, although there was no doubt that she was a talented actress, with her red hair and pale complexion, she didn't exactly seem like an obvious candidate to play a Hispanic character. However, the studio were apparently dead set on MacLaine for the role, believing her to be a big draw, especially given that they had high hopes for her most recent movie, Sweet Charity, that was releasing around the same time. So ultimately, the character of Sister Sara was rewritten to accommodate her casting, and MacLaine was even given top billing over Clint Eastwood despite his previous success in the genre. So at this point, Two Mules for Sister Sara was about as close to being a spaghetti western as it could be without actually being one. But one important missing ingredient was the music. So rather than trying to emulate the famous scores of composers like Ennio Morricone, they decided instead to just hire him outright. And this really paid off, as Morricone ended up delivering a score that was just as iconic and memorable as his previous work on films like The Good, the Bad and the Ugly and Once Upon a Time in the West. Now, given how big of an influence Sergio Leone was on Two Mules for Sister Sara, you'd be forgiven for assuming that he might have directed the film, or that the movie somehow connects to his Dollars trilogy, which Clint Eastwood also famously starred in. But this simply isn't the case. Although, there is one hidden reference that you might have missed, as the character of Hogan actually wears an all but identical gun holster to the Man with No Name, making it even easier for casual moviegoers to assume that the characters are one of the same. So if it wasn't already easy enough to mistake Two Mules for Sister Sara for a spaghetti western directed by Sergio Leone, when the movie released in Finland in 1970, it was actually titled the following, which in English translates to A Handful of Dynamite, which happens to be very similar to A Fistful of Dynamite, the alternative title for Duck You Sucker, another completely unrelated spaghetti western from Sergio Leone, that released just a year later. Now, as for the actual title of Two Mules for Sister Sara, it would be easy to assume that it's referring to the mule that Sarah rides at the beginning of the film, and the smaller, younger one that she picks up later on. But this is actually a burro, rather than a mule. So the second mule in the title is actually intended to be a tongue-in-cheek reference to Hogan, given that in the film, Sarah says,
"All right, Mr. Mule. You know you were right. You are as stubborn as my mule."
So when the movie finally started filming, it was shot in Mexico, which was Don Siegel's first time directing in the country. However, at this point, many other famous westerns had taken to shooting there, such as The Wild Bunch and The War Wagon, forcing Siegel to steer clear of familiar locales in favor of more unusual locations in the country. And although this lent the film a sense of authenticity and originality, the 65-day shoot proved grueling, with many of the cast and crew, including Shirley MacLaine, all falling ill due to having to adjust to the local food and water. Now, another way in which Two Mules for Sister Sara wanted to emulate famous spaghetti westerns was for its visuals. So they decided to hire Gabriel Figueroa, one of Mexico's most renowned cinematographers, who had already worked on over 100 films across all kinds of genres, including westerns. So he did a great job of making the movie look visually unique and interesting, while also including lots of shots and techniques that pay homage to the spaghetti western genre. In fact, he apparently even went as far as to use various color and diffusion filters to specifically try and capture the muted, dusty palettes that you would find in Sergio Leone's movies. Another talented individual working behind the scenes on the movie was Bruce Surtees, who at the time was just a camera operator, but over the course of the shoot forged a strong working relationship with Don Siegel and Clint Eastwood. So this led to him teaming up with the pair again in the future, serving as the director of cinematography on The Beguiled, Dirty Harry and Escape from Alcatraz. And off the back of this, he essentially became Clint Eastwood's go-to cinematographer moving forward, going on to shoot Joe Kidd, High Plains Drifter, The Outlaw Josey Wales and Pale Rider. So despite the undeniable amount of talent that worked on the movie, like most films, there were quite a few mistakes that made it into the final cut. For instance, one of the trio that Hogan shoots dead at the start of the film is clearly still breathing after being shot. And the Colt peacemaker that was used to kill him shouldn't even really exist yet, given that the film is set years before it was made readily available, much like the Winchester rifles and dynamite that also heavily feature. Equally, Bastille Day wasn't actually celebrated during the 1860s, nor were railways built anywhere near Chihuahua during the time in which the movie's set. Now, the making of Two Mules for Sister Sara was not always smooth sailing, especially for director Don Siegel, because during the shoot he frequently got into spats with Shirley MacLaine, allegedly arguing over all sorts of different creative decisions, no matter how trivial, including disagreements about how long her fake eyelashes should be and what side she should dismount her mule. So later, when asked to reflect on his time working with MacLaine, Siegel said, "It's hard to feel any great warmth to her. She's too unfeminine and has too much balls. She's very, very hard." One shot in particular that Don Siegel really struggled with was the scene in which Hogan had to kill a rattlesnake in front of Sarah, so that the pair could camp safely for the night. And the reason for this was that he simply couldn't get a believably frightened reaction out of Shirley MacLaine, who in real life wasn't scared of rattlesnakes in the slightest, given that she was used to seeing them in her backyard. So it was only once Clint Eastwood killed the real snake and gave it to her that MacLaine finally reacted with the fear and revulsion that Siegel had been looking for, which was lucky as they only had one snake at their disposal. And the only reason that Eastwood reluctantly agreed to kill it for real was because the Mexican authorities didn't want the animal released in the area. Another person on the film that Don Siegel reportedly had issues with was its producer Martin Rakin, who ironically was the one who hired him as director in the first place. And this was because the pair were apparently in a constant fight for creative control of the movie, rarely seeing eye to eye. As such, when the movie was finished shooting, Rakin apparently made a point of shutting Siegel out of the post-production, and cut together the final edit of the movie himself, without the director's involvement. So when Two Mules for Sister Sara was finally released, Bud Bowditcher got his first proper chance to see what had come out of the screenplay that he had originally written. And it's safe to say that he wasn't happy, outright dismissing the film, given that it was nothing like his original vision, which was more of a traditional, earnest love story. And to make matters worse, Bowditcher was actually given a story credit on the movie, presumably leading many to believe that he had much more involvement in the final film than he actually did. In fact, to this day, Two Mules for Sister Sara is listed as one of the top films that he's known for on IMDb. So upon the release of the movie, Two Mules for Sister Sara received relatively mixed reviews. For instance, Roger Greenspan of the New York Times said, "I'm not sure it is a great movie, but it is very good, and it stays and grows on the mind the way only movies of exceptional narrative intelligence do." But not everyone was so positive about the movie. For example, Stanley Kaufman of the New Republic said, "It doesn't matter to Siegel that the characters are cliches, the acting is atrocious, the plot laughable, the dialogue dumb, and the patriotic theme only a peg to hang killings on." However, nowadays, Two Mules for Sister Sara is generally viewed as a Western classic, even recently making it into the New York Times guide of the best 1,000 movies ever made. So although the film wasn't exactly a critical darling upon its release, Two Mules for Sister Sara was a success, making $4.8 million on a budget of $2.5 million. This meant that the movie was at least a modestly profitable hit, and a worthwhile endeavour for all those involved. But the question remains as to whether Bud Bowditcher's original version of the movie would have performed better or worse in the long run. So after Two Mules for Sister Sara, Clint Eastwood opted to work with Don Siegel again just a year later on The Beguiled, establishing a strong friendship with the director, which saw them collaborate on big hits such as Dirty Harry and Escape from Alcatraz. Two Mules for Sister Sara also proved to be one of the last westerns that Clint Eastwood would star in that he didn't direct himself, with the final one being Joe Kidd that released just 2 years later.
When Mr. Harm doesn't want me around anymore, you let me know, huh, boy?
So Joe Kidd actually shares a lot of DNA with The Great Silence, a 1968 spaghetti western directed by Sergio Corbucci, who's best known for directing Django. But in many ways, The Great Silence was his more impressive film, following a mute gunslinger defending a group of outlaws against a vicious bounty hunter, exploring the thin line between right and wrong. So having essentially become the face of spaghetti westerns in the US, Clint Eastwood was reportedly interested in starring in an English-language remake of the movie, and rumour has it that 20th Century Fox bought the rights to The Great Silence with the hope of luring Eastwood away from Universal Studios, even going as far as to hold off on releasing the original Italian version in the States to make way for its impending remake. However, when the studio head actually sat down to watch the movie, he was apparently deeply unimpressed with the film, especially its infamously cynical ending. As a result, talks of any remake quickly dried up, but Clint Eastwood made a point of paying tribute to what could have been by including lots of references to The Great Silence in Joe Kidd, including its wintry setting, the hat that Eastwood wears, and the appearance of a Mauser C96 pistol. Now, the story for Joe Kidd originally started out as a screenplay called The Sonoma Courthouse Raid, written by Elmore Leonard, a veteran Western writer who previously penned the stories that inspired 3:10 to Yuma, The Tall T, Hombre, and even Justified. And Joe Kidd was actually one of the first times that Leonard wrote an original story specifically for the big screen, with the second coming 2 years later in Mr. Majestic, starring Charles Bronson, which was similar to Joe Kidd in that it also starred an iconic Western actor playing a no-nonsense tough guy who defends vulnerable Mexican characters. So Joe Kidd is actually partly based on real events, as Elmore Leonard was very much inspired by a famous activist who headed up a movement by Mexicans to reclaim their ancestral lands from Anglo ownership, which led to the storming of a New Mexico courthouse in 1967, which is somewhat reminiscent of the opening scene in Joe Kidd, where Louis Chalmer and his followers break into the Sonoma courthouse to protest their stolen land. So once the script was picked up, it was retitled Joe Kidd, and Universal decided to go with John Sturges as director, best known for westerns such as Bad Day at Black Rock, Gunfight at the OK Corral, and The Magnificent Seven. However, probably his most famous film was The Great Escape, which was widely considered a masterpiece, setting expectations sky high for Joe Kidd. So when it came to casting the main character of Joe Kidd, John Sturges clearly wanted to go for an actor that he'd worked with in the past, approaching Charles Bronson and Steve McQueen to star, but both of them turned him down. As a result, the part was offered to veteran actor Robert Mitchum, but he too said no. So following his failed attempt to remake The Great Silence, Clint Eastwood was approached by Universal about starring in Joe Kidd, which had a somewhat similar premise on paper. But the biggest draw for Eastwood was the fact that Elmore Leonard had written the script, considering how many of his stories had gone on to inspire classic Western movies. But with that being said, Eastwood still wasn't 100% sold on the project, mainly because the movie didn't yet have an ending. But director John Sturges proved to be a talented salesman, convincing Eastwood that it wasn't a problem, and that it would be figured out along the way. So eventually, Clint Eastwood accepted the role of Joe Kidd, and was believed to have been granted significant creative influence over the movie in return. Another issue that they had with casting was for the character of Frank Harlan, a wealthy landowner that acted as the central villain of the film, because initially they were dead set on Gene Hackman, but he had to turn the role down, as he was already busy shooting for the Poseidon adventure. This led to Robert Duvall being cast instead, who ultimately did a good job of elevating what could have been a fairly one-dimensional villain. So even though Clint Eastwood wasn't the first choice for Joe Kidd, upon joining the film he was reunited with more than a few familiar faces. For instance, actor Don Stroud had already shared the screen with Eastwood in Coogan's Bluff. Likewise, the film's composer Lalo Schifrin had already worked with Eastwood as a composer on Kelly's Heroes, The Beguiled, and Dirty Harry. Even the cinematographer Bruce Surtees was a frequent collaborator of Eastwood's, having previously shot The Beguiled, Play Misty for Me, and Dirty Harry. So with Clint Eastwood now in the starring role, it would make sense for those behind the movie to want to lean into his iconic turn as the man with no name, given how popular those movies proved to be. So much like A Fistful of Dollars, the movie positions Clint Eastwood as a no-nonsense gunslinging anti-hero caught between two warring factions, and even features a character called Ramon. Likewise, the film's score feels very much inspired by the work of Ennio Morricone, giving Joe Kidd a pseudo-spaghetti western flavor, despite being an American production. Joe Kidd also showcased a lot of unique firearms that didn't typically appear in all that many westerns at the time, with perhaps the most eye-catching being the C96 broom handle Mauser, which later in the movie is fitted with a stock so that it can be shouldered like a rifle, much like its appearance in The Great Silence. The movie also features a notable amount of scoped rifles, including a Savage 99, a Remington Keen Frontier, and a Canadian Ross Model 1910, which for the most part were historically accurate. So when Joe Kidd finally started filming, it was mainly filmed in the Alabama hills at Lone Pine, California, but the fictional town of Sonora was actually shot in Arizona, on a western town set used for famous John Wayne movies such as Rio Bravo and El Dorado. So once production on the movie began, it quickly became clear that Clint Eastwood was not at all well, apparently showing symptoms of a bronchial infection. But it turned out that he was actually suffering from a debilitating allergic reaction, originally believed to be brought on by horses. However, it eventually became clear that it was in fact being caused by cats that were sneaking into the hotel that he was staying in while filming. Another thing that apparently caused tension behind the scenes was the lean, economical directing style of John Sturges, who was viewed by some as treating filmmaking as just a day job, especially towards the end of his career. In fact, in an interview, actor Don Stroud even went as far as to say that Sturges just wasn't there and wasn't in charge during the making of Joe Kidd. He also claimed that one day Clint Eastwood personally arranged for an ice cream truck to drive out to where they were shooting in the middle of nowhere, just to try and cheer everybody up. Even writer Elmore Leonard was disappointed with how the filming went, believing that the cast was so awestruck by Sturges and his reputation as a director that they simply surrendered authority to him. Now, one person on set who certainly wasn't hands-off was Clint Eastwood, who was believed to have had quite a lot of creative control over the movie, which ended up being noticeably different to the original script. For instance, the character of Louis Charmer was apparently far more layered and heroic in the script compared to how he appeared in the final film, and some believe that the reason for this was that Clint Eastwood wanted to make it more obvious to the audience that Joe Kidd was the main hero of the film, and therefore Charmer was ultimately made to look more opportunistic and less sympathetic as a result. Perhaps as a consequence of the changes to his character, actor John Saxon apparently later regretted playing Louis Charmer, especially as he wasn't actually of Mexican descent like his character. There are even rumors that he attended a meeting of a Latin American organization opposed to stereotypes to publicly apologize for playing such a dubious character. So even when Joe Kidd was filming, nobody working on the movie knew for sure how the film was actually going to end. But one day on set, John Sturges noticed a railway track that ran straight through town, which stopped yards away from a saloon. This apparently led him to half-jokingly suggest that the train should crash through the bar room in the climax of the movie, to which Eastwood responded, "Jesus, anything at this point, let's end it," capping off the movie with probably its most memorable moment. So considering all the reports of problems on set, it probably shouldn't come as a surprise that Joe Kidd features quite a few mistakes. For instance, at the start of the film when Joe's lying on the cot in jail, his cellmate pours coffee into a mug on the corner of the table, but then proceeds to fill it again in the next shot. Also, during this shot of Joe, you can see a priest exit the church in the background. And in the very next scene, you can see the same priest coming out of the church again. Then later on in the film, during the shootout in the village, when one of the henchmen is shot in a doorway, you can actually see the brick wall he lands against shake like it's made of rubber. So when Joe Kidd finally premiered in 1972, the movie grossed $6.3 million worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing westerns of that year. So not only did John Sturges beat out the sequel to his most famous western, but Joe Kidd also became his second most successful film at the box office, just behind The Great Escape. So despite a strong box office showing, Joe Kidd received a very mixed reception from fans and critics alike. For instance, Roger Greenspun of the New York Times said, "For perhaps its first half hour, John Sturgis's new western, Joe Kidd, looks surprisingly good. Nothing remarkable, but modestly decent. A feeling that persists with continuingly diminishing assurance, almost until the climax, when everything is thrown away in a flash of false theatrics, foolish symbolism, and what I suspect is sloppy editing." But nowadays, there's a general acceptance that although Joe Kidd is certainly one of Clint Eastwood's weakest Western outings, it still has a lot going for it, and plenty of potential, but for whatever reason clearly fell short of what it could have been. So following the release of Joe Kidd, Clint Eastwood rarely spoke about the movie, unlike his other westerns that he was clearly a lot more proud of. In fact, in his biography, Joe Kidd is described as a totally conventional western, utterly without distinguishable characteristics. And perhaps tellingly, Joe Kidd was the last western that Clint Eastwood ever starred in that he didn't direct himself, with his next movie being High Plains Drifter, which proved to be a huge critical and commercial success.
You can't turn all these people out into the night. It is inhuman, brother, inhuman.
I'm not your brother.
So High Plains Drifter actually started out as an original screenplay written by Ernest Tidyman, an Oscar-winning screenwriter and author best known for writing Shaft and The French Connection. And he was apparently inspired to write the story upon hearing about the infamous real-life murder of Kitty Genovese, whose death was believed to have had over 38 witnesses, yet not a single one of them reported anything to the police. So this is very similar to the way in which the townspeople of Largo stood idly by as their marshal was brutally murdered, with the film really delving into themes of community cowardice and silent complicity. So in 1972, Clint Eastwood had just finished up starring in Dirty Harry and Joe Kidd, and had recently made his directorial debut with the 1971 psychological thriller Play Misty for Me. And for his next film, Eastwood decided it was time to try his hand at making a western. So upon reading the original 9-page proposal for High Plains Drifter, he approached Universal about directing it, apparently really liking the story's offbeat quality. But with that being said, once the film got the green light, Eastwood brought in screenwriter Dean Reisner to provide uncredited revisions to the screenplay, apparently filling in various plot holes with allegory and black humor, very much influenced by Sergio Leone. So when it came to casting, Clint Eastwood opted to play the main character himself, despite also being the director, which was the start of a larger trend in his career, especially in regards to westerns. But for the rest of the cast, he typically went for actors that he'd already previously worked with. For instance, William O'Connell, who played the barber, had already worked with Eastwood on Paint Your Wagon, and Paul Brinegar, who played the saloon keeper, previously starred alongside Eastwood in Rawhide, as the character of Wishbone. Also, Buddy Van Horn, who plays Marshall Duncan, was actually Eastwood's longtime stunt double. So given that High Plains Drifter was only the second film that Clint Eastwood had ever directed, it was important for him to put together a talented, trustworthy team to help him behind the scenes. So for his cinematographer, he went for Bruce Surtees, who we first met on the set of Two Mules for Sister Sara, before working together again on The Beguiled, Play Misty for Me, and Dirty Harry. And for a composer, he hired Dee Barton, who had previously composed parts of the score for his latest movie, Play Misty for Me. Now, one thing that Clint Eastwood and Universal didn't agree on in the early stages was where High Plains Drifter should be shot, because Universal wanted the movie to be filmed on its backlot, but Eastwood was keen to shoot on location. The only problem was that he didn't know where. However, one day when he was out scouting locations alone in his pickup truck, he came upon the Mono Lake area in California, which he thought would make for a highly photogenic and original setting for a western. Now, the only problem with the location that Clint Eastwood picked was that there wasn't really any pre-existing settlements in the area that could pass for a Wild West mining town. So Eastwood decided to build one from scratch, hiring over 50 technicians and construction workers to build 14 houses, a church, and a 2-story hotel. And what was even more impressive is that rather than just building facades, Eastwood requested that the buildings have fully fitted interiors, so that he could seamlessly shoot indoor scenes on site. So in the end, the town of Largo took 18 days to construct, but proved to be a huge undertaking, that ended up using 150,000 feet of lumber. And later on in the shoot, when the town needed to be painted red, again Eastwood refused to cut corners and had the whole set painted for real, using 380 gallons of paint in the process. Now, although Clint Eastwood was clearly willing to do whatever it took to make High Plains Drifter look as authentic as possible, he still managed to be surprisingly efficient in his filmmaking. For instance, in the end, the film actually came in under budget and 2 days ahead of schedule, as Eastwood filmed the movie in sequence, and apparently even edited the movie on location in a log cabin on the shores of Mono Lake. And once the film was complete, Largo was burned to the ground, leaving no sign that it ever even existed. So as impressive as the movie was, High Plains Drifter was not without its fair share of mistakes. For instance, in the iconic scene where the stranger is stood on the porch watching the townspeople practice shooting, he takes a sip of his half-finished beer and says,
"No, you're gonna look awfully silly with that knife sticking up your ass."
And then, in the next shot, takes another sip from the same glass that's now nearly full. Also, during the scene in the general store where the stranger gives 2 children jars of candy, you can clearly see that they have plastic lids, despite plastic not yet being invented. So at this stage in Clint Eastwood's career, he was quickly becoming the face of the Western genre, having already played the stoic, cigar-smoking gunslinger in countless other films. As such, it was easy for casual moviegoers to assume that Eastwood was essentially playing the same character in each movie, especially given that they often shared similar outfits and mannerisms. And High Plains Drifter very much continued that trend, as the stranger wears a very similar hat to the man with no name, and is once again armed with a Colt single-action army that the character of Hogan uses in 2 Mules for Sister Sara. So considering that High Plains Drifter was the first Western that Clint Eastwood ever directed, it makes sense that he would be heavily influenced by Sergio Leone, given how many spaghetti westerns they made together. So whether intentional or not, High Plains Drifter is littered with callbacks to the Dollars trilogy, from the way the stranger shoots hats off heads, lights fuses with cigars, and goes through the whole movie without ever even telling anybody his name. Another reference in High Plains Drifter that's easy to miss can be found in Largo's cemetery, because on 2 of the tombstones are the names Don Siegel and Sergio Leone, which was Eastwood's way of humorously paying tribute to the 2 directors that ended up having a huge impact on his career, thanks to his roles as Dirty Harry and the Man with No Name. So in most English-speaking countries, the movie was known exclusively as High Plains Drifter, a vague, non-specific title that played into the mysterious, open-ended nature of the movie. However, this was not the case in other countries, as High Plains Drifter went by lots of other names that all had very different connotations. For instance, in Italy, its title loosely translates to the Nameless Stranger, while in Spain, the movie was known as Hell of Cowards. Meanwhile, in Poland, it was simply called The Avenger, and in Sweden, they went with a title that means The Man with the Ox Whip. So probably the most famous element of High Plains Drifter is its twist ending, which forces you to look at the events of the movie in a completely different light. Because it strongly suggested that the stranger is the avenging spirit of Marshal Jim Duncan, who was brutally whipped to death by outlaws while the townspeople just stood back and watched. And we see hints of this in how much the stranger seems to know about the murder, and the biblical manner in which he delivers justice to those responsible. There's also the scene in the hotel where the innkeeper's wife brings up the dead Marshal to the stranger and says,
"Have you ever heard the name Jim Duncan? He was town marshal here. He's lying out there in an unmarked grave. They say the dead don't rest without a marker of some kind."
This is then followed up with the scene in which Mordecai says,
"I never did know your name."
Yes, you do.
And then the camera pans to reveal the name Marshal Jim Duncan, suggesting that this was the stranger's identity all along. However, despite all of this, Clint Eastwood actually always intended for the stranger to be the brother of the Marshal, hence why he cast his stunt double to play the character. But on reflection, Eastwood liked that the ending proved ambiguous enough that it allowed for different interpretations, and has since invited viewers to make up their own minds on who the stranger really was. So when High Plains Drifter finally released, for the most part it was very well received by critics and general audiences alike. For instance, Derek Adams of Time Out said, "This was supposed to be Eastwood's fond adieu to the worlds of Sergio Leone and Don Siegel, and indeed he cuts the operatic excess of the former with the punchy economy of the latter." Equally impressed was Kim Newman of Empire magazine, who called it a funny, brutal, scary movie, daringly surreal in its mix of Western and horror themes. But of course, the movie still had its detractors. For instance, Nigel Andrews of the Monthly Film Bulletin said, "Afterplay misty for me, High Plains Drifter emerges as a disappointingly sterile exercise in style, suggesting that the first thing Eastwood should do as a director is forget the lessons he has learned from other filmmakers and start to forge a convincing style of his own." So ultimately, High Plains Drifter went on to make $15.7 million on a budget of just $5.5 million, making it a big box office hit, and remains one of the top grossing westerns of the 1970s. Now, as popular as High Plains Drifter was, it was not without its controversy, due to the graphic, brutal way in which Eastwood approached scenes that involved sex and violence. So Universal had no choice but to release the movie with an R rating, and some of the scenes were deemed so extreme that High Plains Drifter would often air on TV, with lots of parts dramatically cut down and trimmed to avoid offense. Now, possibly the harshest critic of High Plains Drifter ended up being none other than the legendary Western actor John Wayne, because when Eastwood wrote to Wayne about the possibility of them starring in a Western together in the future, Wayne sent back a scathing letter about the movie, denouncing it for its violence and revisionist portrayal of the Old West. And so, Eastwood decided it best not to reply, and ultimately gave up on the idea of ever starring in a movie alongside Wayne. However, on reflection, Clint Eastwood was able to understand why John Wayne hated the film so much, given how far removed it was from a traditional Western, saying, "High Plains Drifter was meant to be a fable. It wasn't meant to show the hours of pioneering drudgery. It wasn't supposed to be anything about settling the West." With Eastwood later going on to say, "I realized that there's two different generations, and he wouldn't understand what I was doing." So although John Wayne wasn't a fan of the movie, High Plains Drifter found plenty of high-profile fans elsewhere. For instance, Shaun of the Dead and Baby Driver director Edgar Wright called it his favourite Clint Eastwood American Western, even above Unforgiven, and felt that it had a big influence on Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill. Also, to this day, High Plains Drifter still features in the book of 1001 movies you must see before you die. So following the success of High Plains Drifter, Clint Eastwood opted to direct another Western 6 years later called Pale Rider. And even now, many still assume that the two films are somehow connected, given that they both feature Clint Eastwood as a mysterious, vengeful stranger in a plot that includes similar supernatural biblical undertones. On top of this, both films open and close in an identical manner, with the stranger riding in from the distance at the start and away into the background at the end. However, Clint Eastwood has confirmed that the two films are entirely standalone and not narratively connected. Although he did admit that High Plains Drifter heavily inspired Pale Rider, as Eastwood wanted to revisit the idea of a Western about a ghostly avenger with a mysterious origin, but in a way that was a lot less cynical and nihilistic than his previous movie.
Well, you're gonna pull those pistols and whistle Dixie.
The origin of the movie can be traced back to a book called The Rebel Outlaw Josey Wales, a privately printed novel that was submitted to Clint Eastwood's production company, Malpaso Productions, with the hope that it might get picked up and adapted into a film. But the chances of this were very slim, as the office was always flooded with submissions, and any unsolicited manuscripts were typically sent back unread. But on this occasion, producer Robert Daly was intrigued by the unusual cover letter that was included with the novel, which referred to Clint Eastwood's kind eyes, and humbly requested his consideration. So the producer took the book home to read, and was absolutely blown away by its quality, feeling that the lead role was a perfect fit for Clint Eastwood. So he immediately flew the novel out to him, and Eastwood loved it, even going as far as to personally contribute funds to secure the screen rights. So once they'd obtained the rights to the novel, producer Robert Daly reached out to its unknown author, a Cherokee man called Forrest Carter, who was rewarded a lucrative republication of his book by a mainstream publisher, under the new title of Gone to Texas. But when Daly finally met the author face to face, he was shocked by his behaviour, believing him to be a sociopath, after he drunkenly urinated in a public bar and later professed his love to a woman at knife point. Despite this, Carter was able to publish a second book called The Education of Little Tree, which became an award-winning bestseller, marketed as a memoir of his childhood in the Appalachian Mountains, where he was raised by his Cherokee grandparents. However, this turned out to be just as fictional as Josey Wales, as it was later discovered that Forrest Carter was in fact Asa Earl, a former KKK leader and segregationist speechwriter for the American politician George Wallace, a shocking discovery that probably never would have been made if not for the overwhelming success of the Outlaw Josey Wales. Now, although the movie was based on a book, it was transformed into a screenplay by Sonia Chernis, as well as its director Philip Kaufman, who was a big fan of the original novel. So he wanted to keep the script as close to the source material as possible, maintaining its depiction of Josey Wales as a straight-talking, tobacco-spitting gunslinger. Equally, side characters from the book such as Lone Waite, Laura Lee, Little Moonlight and Grandma Sarah all ended up featuring heavily in the movie. But he did make some key changes. For instance, the Union soldiers chasing Josey at the start of the film essentially drop out of the story halfway through the novel. So in the film, he decided to keep them around as an ongoing threat, to facilitate the action-packed shootout at the end of the movie. Kaufman also did his best to strip the screenplay of most of its political ideology, but did retain much of the pro-South, anti-North sentiment that originated in the novel. But ultimately, the screenplay juggled all of these elements surprisingly well, resonating across the political spectrum, while also being praised for its refreshingly nuanced and respectful portrayal of Native Americans. So when it came to who should direct the movie, Clint Eastwood decided to go with Philip Kaufman, very much impressed by his underrated 1972 western, The Great Northfield Minnesota Raid. However, as soon as production began, Clint Eastwood realized that he might have made a mistake, as Kaufman proved to be a very particular, meticulous filmmaker, which was practically the opposite to Eastwood, who was big on efficiency and working things out through trial and error. It also didn't help that during the first scene that they shot, where Laura Lee is attacked in the desert, Eastwood apparently felt as if Kaufman lost control of the scene, and didn't agree with the way that actress Sandra Locke had been treated during its filming. But the moment that really seemed to break their working relationship was when it came time to shoot the scene in which Josey rides over the dunes against the sun. This was because Kaufman had already scouted the perfect hill to shoot the scene on, and had even left a bottle there as a marker to find it later on. But due to the shifting sands, it eventually became buried and impossible to find, yet Kaufman apparently refused to shoot the scene anywhere else, and was adamant about finding the exact hill that he had originally spotted. As a result, Eastwood suggested that the director take a car out to go search for it. And the moment that he left, the actor immediately took charge, quickly filming the scene in question while they still had light. But when Kaufman eventually returned, he was furious, feeling as if his authority as a director had now been fatally compromised. Another issue that came between the pair was the casting of actress Sandra Locke as Laura Lee, a casting that Clint Eastwood really pushed for, against the wishes of the director, who couldn't understand why a 32-year-old woman was being cast for a 22-year-old character. But the irony was that when filming started, there were rumors that Kaufman actually developed an infatuation for Locke, right around the same time as Clint Eastwood, who went on to have a 13-year relationship with the actress, while starring alongside each other in numerous movies. So it eventually became clear that Philip Kaufman just wasn't the right fit for Clint Eastwood, who arranged a private meeting with the director and fired him after just 10 days of shooting. And the decision apparently didn't go down well on set, with several members of the cast and crew holding it against Eastwood, feeling as if he took a lot of credit for Kaufman's work, such as his location and costume decisions, as well as the casting of Chief Dan George. Now, unbeknownst to Clint Eastwood, his firing of Philip Kaufman ended up having much bigger ramifications beyond the film itself. because news of the sacking was met with outrage from the Directors Guild of America, given that Kaufman had already put a lot of work into the film, including completing all of its pre-production. In fact, the backlash was so bad that when Warner Brothers and Clint Eastwood refused to reinstate Kaufman, they were reportedly fined $60,000. And to stop the same thing from happening again in the future, the Guild decided to pass a new rule known as the Eastwood Rule, which prevents an actor or producer from firing the director in order to take the position for themselves. So in a whirlwind of controversy, Clint Eastwood officially became the director of the Outlaw Josey Wales moving forward, making it just the second Western that he'd ever directed. So when it came to casting, Clint Eastwood made a point of hiring actors that he'd already worked with before, and knew he could trust. For instance, John Vernon, who played Fletcher, also played the mayor in Dirty Harry. Likewise, John Quaid, who plays the outlaw leader, famously appeared in High Plains Drifter as one of the townspeople. And Sheb Wooley had already starred alongside Eastwood in multiple episodes of Rawhide. Also, another noteworthy casting is Matt Clark as a bartender, who later played a similar role in Back to the Future 3, in which he says he only serves whiskey to Marty, which some believe is a subtle callback to when he tells Josie that he's run out of whiskey. Now, perhaps one of the most memorable castings in the movie was that of Chief Dan George, who totally stole the show as the character of Lone Waite. And the reason that he was hired was all because of his memorable performance in Little Big Man, for which he earned a supporting actor nomination at the Academy Awards. However, when filming started on the Outlaw Josey Wales, the 76-year-old actor was clearly having trouble memorizing his lines, so much so that Clint Eastwood got into the habit of ruining takes by mouthing the actor's lines to try and help him. So in the end, Eastwood told the actor to just forget his lines, and instead perform his interpretations of them, which ended up sounding far more authentic and compelling than what was written in the script. So over the course of the shoot, Eastwood forged a genuine admiration for the actor, even getting emotional when it came time to shoot their final scene together. Now, a big reason why the Outlaw Josey Wales looked so visually impressive was because Clint Eastwood hired his most trusted cinematographer, Bruce Surtees, who previously shot High Plains Drifter. So he knew exactly how to get the most out of the film's various shooting locations. They included Arizona, Utah, and California. They also made a point of shooting in the fall, when there are a lot more natural shadows, which ended up being a big part of the visual identity of the movie. Another really important aspect of the film was its music. So Clint Eastwood hired composer Jerry Fielding, who already had a history working on westerns, such as The Wild Bunch and Chato's Land. And for the Outlaw Josey Wales, he delivered a memorable yet understated score that really added to the film, earning him an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Score. So although Clint Eastwood hadn't originally planned on directing the movie, at this stage in his career he'd already had a lot of experience in how to do so, having previously worked under many famous directors. But perhaps none proved as influential on this film as Sergio Leone, with the character of Josey Wales feeling very much like the man with no name. The movie also shared a lot of visual DNA with the Dollars trilogy, including its panoramic landscapes, expressive close-ups, and distinctive quick cuts. In fact, in an interview, Clint Eastwood went as far as to directly compare the movie to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, except for one major difference, saying, "Josey Wales is a hero, and you see how he gets to where he is, rather than just having a mysterious hero appear on the plains and become involved with other people's plight." So as well made as the Outlaw Josey Wales was, it isn't without its mistakes. For instance, during the climax of the movie, despite only 15 soldiers crossing the creek to confront Josie, he and his allies somehow kill well over 20 men in the gunfight that follows. Also, at the start of the movie, when Josie starts using the Gatling gun, despite the weapon only being able to hold between 20 to 50 rounds, Josie fires way more, killing numerous soldiers, while their horses stand unconcerned in the line of fire behind them. So following the high-profile firing of Philip Kaufman, it was very clear who was in charge on set, with Clint Eastwood now serving as the movie's lead actor, producer, and director. And although Warner Brothers were generally very pleased with how the movie was shaping up, they did have some notes after being shown a screening of the finished film, with perhaps the biggest being that they would like it to be shortened by half an hour. But when the studio sent an executive to give this feedback to Eastwood, the director told him that he would have to do it himself, as he was busy. And when the executive asked where Eastwood would be, he replied, "I'll be across the street at Paramount cutting a new deal." So it seemed the studio got the message loud and clear, as the film was left uncut and ended up being 2 hours and 15 minutes long. So around the time that the Outlaw Josey Wales released, westerns had dramatically declined in popularity, especially ones centered around the Civil War, so there was a real skepticism in Hollywood about the movie. However, the Outlaw Josey Wales was a big commercial hit, earning $31.8 million against a $3.7 million budget, making it one of Clint Eastwood's most profitable films at the time. So a big reason why The Outlaw Josey Wales was such a success was because it was universally embraced by audiences and critics alike. For instance, Phil Hardy of Time Out said, "It demonstrated Eastwood's ability to recreate his first starring role as the mythic man with no name of the Italian westerns, and to subtly undercut it through comedy and mockery." Likewise, Tony Sloman of the Radio Times said, "Clint Eastwood seized the directorial reins from Phil Kaufman and fashioned this tough, sprawling post-Civil War Western epic into something approaching a personal testament." Now, considering its overwhelmingly positive reception, it's probably no surprise that The Outlaw Josey Wales has left behind a considerable legacy. For instance, the famous TV host Johnny Carson called it the greatest western of all time. Likewise, the legendary director Orson Welles admitted to seeing it 4 times, claiming it belongs with the great westerns of John Ford and Howard Hawks. Since then, the movie was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry, and is still widely considered one of the greatest westerns ever made. So given how popular The Outlaw Josey Wales proved to be, Clint Eastwood is often asked about the meaning of the movie. So in an interview in 2011, he finally revealed that he intended the movie to be an anti-war film, saying, "As for Josey Wales, I saw the parallels to the modern day at the time. Everybody gets tired of it, but it never ends. A war is a horrible thing, but it's also a unifier of countries. Man becomes his most creative during war. Look at the amount of weaponry that was made in 4 short years of World War II, and just the urgency and the camaraderie and the unifying. But that's kind of a sad statement on mankind, if that's what it takes." So shortly after the rebel Outlaw Josey Wales was republished, its author actually released a follow-up novel called The Vengeance Trail of Josey Wales. Set shortly after the events of the first movie, the book picks up with Josey Wales living quietly with his now wife Laura Lee and their baby son, until news reaches him that a close friend of his has been murdered and captured by a Mexican emperor. So Josey decides to come out of hiding to travel to Mexico and confront a corrupt lawman in order to break his surviving friend out of jail. And Clint Eastwood actually intended to adapt this novel into a sequel to The Outlaw Josey Wales. However, the plans ultimately fell through. So instead, the book was adapted into the 1986 film The Return of Josey Wales, directed by Michael Parks, who also played Josey. And upon its release, the film received universally negative reviews, with critics across the board panning it as a cheap, uninspired cash grab, hence why nowadays it's all but forgotten. So despite its controversial origin and turbulent production, nowadays Clint Eastwood considers The Outlaw Josey Wales one of the best films of his career, and one of the most satisfying movies he's ever made. It also proved that he was no longer an up-and-coming, unproven actor-turned-director, and was more than capable of directing himself in movies moving forward, especially when it came to westerns. But even so, he decided to wait 9 years before making another western with 1985's Pale Rider, which proved to be just as well made and well received as The Outlaw Josey Wales.
There's nothing like a nice piece of hickory.
So after the release of the Outlaw Josey Wales, Clint Eastwood was keen to direct another western, but was aware that the genre had really fallen out of favour. However, Eastwood felt that if he could come up with a western that had a modern twist that defied what people typically expect from the genre, then people would want to see it. So with a clear theme in mind, Clint Eastwood got in touch with screenwriters Michael Butler and Dennis Shriak, who'd previously written his 1977 movie The Gauntlet, and he commissioned them to write an original western script that was ultimately titled Pale Rider. So anybody that's watched High Plains Drifter will likely notice that the film shares a lot in common with Pale Rider, with both films following a nameless gunslinger who appears out of nowhere to defend a desperate community, doing so in a manner that suggests that they have a hidden supernatural or biblical origin. On top of this, both films open and close with the exact same shots. But this crossover wasn't by accident, as Clint Eastwood consciously wanted to revisit the otherworldly themes that featured in that movie, saying, "I guess maybe I felt I hadn't explored it enough." So although the two films are not directly connected, it would be fair to call Pale Rider a spiritual sequel to High Plains Drifter. Another western that Pale Rider is remarkably similar to is the 1953 classic Shane, with both centering on a mysterious gunslinger who arrives in a troubled frontier community to help defend peaceful settlers, with the teenage girl Megan standing in for the hero-worshipping young boy Joey. In fact, the films are so alike that they even share the same ending, with the heroes riding off into the distance as their young admirers cry out their names.
Preacher!
So although Clint Eastwood was confident in his idea for Pale Rider, he still had to overcome the challenge of getting it made, at a time in which westerns were simply not in demand. And Eastwood apparently believed that this decline was due to the masters of the genre no longer directing, such as Anthony Mann, Howard Hawks, and John Ford. But there was no doubt that the infamous box office failure of Heaven's Gate 5 years prior also played a big role in their decline. Either way, Clint Eastwood still had to convince the studio to make Pale Rider, arguing that popular films at the time like Star Wars were essentially just westerns set in space, and that nobody had as good of a track record in the genre as him, pointing out that the Outlaw Josey Wales was one of the last financially successful westerns at that time. So eventually the studio agreed, and allowed Clint Eastwood to make Pale Rider, despite the very real possibility that it could flop at the box office. Now, with so much riding on the movie, Clint Eastwood was keen to put together a talented cast that could lend the film some gravitas. So for the character of Hull Barrett, he cast Michael Moriarty, who had an award-winning career in theatre, but was still waiting for his breakthrough role in film. And for the character of Sarah Wheeler, Eastwood went for actress Carrie Snodgrass, who had earned an Oscar nomination for her performance in Diary of a Mad Housewife, with Pale Rider acting as her long-overdue return to major cinema. Eastwood was also keen to cast new talent as well, such as 13-year-old Sydney Penny, who had already won awards for her work on The Thornbirds. Likewise, Eastwood handed Chris Penn his first big break, allowing him to step out of the shadow of his famous older brother and go on to bag roles in The Young Riders, Reservoir Dogs, and True Romance. Now, one of the more important roles in the movie was that of its villain, the corrupt lawman Stockburn, which required an actor steely enough to believably go toe-to-toe with Eastwood on the big screen. So the director decided to go with the American actor John Russell, an ex-Marine who had already had an impressive career in the Western genre, even appearing in the Outlaw Josey Wales as Bloody Bill Anderson. And he proved to be the perfect casting for Stockburn, delivering a masterclass in restrained menace that really elevated the tension of the final duel. Another casting that shouldn't be overlooked is that of Richard Kiel as Club, having previously risen to stardom in the James Bond franchise as the metal-mouthed henchman Jaws. And as much as his 7-foot height was a big reason for his casting, it did prove problematic at times, as the first horse that he was given to ride actually collapsed under his weight. Also, due to ongoing back problems, the actor found it difficult getting up into his saddle, hence why the preacher helps Club back onto his horse. Now, as for the team behind the camera, Clint Eastwood opted to hire Bruce Surtees as his cinematographer, given that he'd shot all 3 of his last westerns. And once again, he did an excellent job of evoking the beauty and harshness of the Old West, making use of natural light and shadow while really capturing the majesty of the breathtaking scenery. However, Pale Rider proved to be the last western that Bruce Surtees ever shot for Clint Eastwood, ending a 12-year tradition that all started with High Plains Drifter. So although Pale Rider was set in California's Sierra Nevada gold country, it was actually primarily filmed in the Sawtooth mountain range in central Idaho. And this proved to be a perfect pick, with the location offering lots of majestic mountain backdrops, untouched woodland, and secluded valleys. It was also very convenient for Clint Eastwood, who actually owned a home nearby in Sun Valley. So as experienced as Clint Eastwood was at filming westerns, while shooting Pale Rider, he ended up suffering one of the worst injuries of his career up to that point. Because while filming a riding scene, Eastwood's horse suddenly fell through thin ice and launched the actor forward, dislocating his shoulder. But thankfully, Clint Eastwood made a speedy recovery and was able to continue filming. So Clint Eastwood was not exactly known for including all that many direct references to other movies in his westerns, yet Pale Rider includes quite a few tributes to other famous films. For instance, the scene in which the preacher dispatches a group of henchmen with an axe handle is believed to be a reference to the samurai genre, in particular the work of Akira Kurosawa, the director of Yojimbo, which served as the direct inspiration for A Fistful of Dollars. Also, Stockburn's men all wear beige dusters, that's very reminiscent of the gunmen that feature in the iconic opening scene of Once Upon a Time in the West, directed by Sergio Leone, who gave Clint Eastwood his breakout role as the man with no name. Also, another visual callback can be found at the climax of the movie, when the preacher travels alone through town, towards a duel that he seems guaranteed to lose, just like Gary Cooper in the 1952 western High Noon. Another movie that Pale Rider has a lot in common with is Back to the Future 3. For starters, they share a lot of the same cast, including Richard Dysart, Marvin J. McIntyre, and Teddy Conway. Even the train station in Pale Rider is the same one that features in Back to the Future 3, and the scene where Stockburn's men make Spider dance is exactly what happens to Marty, who funnily enough spends the entire film using the alias of Clint Eastwood. So once Pale Rider was done filming, a trailer was released to promote the movie, which was perfectly well received in the States, but really confused viewers in the UK. Because in the trailer, a song is used called Best Endeavours, which any Brit like me will instantly recognise as the opening theme music to the Channel 4 news. But because the network failed to secure permanent exclusivity rights to the music, it was perfectly fine for the theme to be used in the trailer, making for a bizarre watch for anybody from the UK. So when Pale Rider finally hit cinemas in October 1985, it was very unclear how the movie would perform, given the stigma that surrounded the genre at the time. However, the movie ended up being a big success, making $41.4 million at the box office against a $6.9 million budget. And as a result, it became one of the highest grossing westerns of the 1980s, and proved Clint Eastwood was still a considerable box office draw as an action star, even in his 50s. Now, despite its strong box office showing and popularity with general audiences, Pale Rider didn't actually go down all that well with critics, who felt it was a rehash of older, better westerns. For instance, Rita Kempley of the Washington Post said, "The trail is all too familiar, and pretty soon we recollect why westerns lost their appeal." Although other critics were a lot kinder, such as Robert Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times, who said, "Eastwood understands so well how he works on the screen that the movie has a resonance that probably was not even there in the screenplay." But either way, nowadays, Pale Rider is regarded as one of Clint Eastwood's most well-crafted, intriguing westerns that's really managed to stand the test of time. Now, as mentioned earlier, the western genre was in a big slump around the time that Pale Rider was releasing, so the media really latched on to the idea that the genre could be on the verge of making a comeback, especially given that Lawrence Kasdan's star-studded western Silverado was releasing around the same time. So the fact that both movies were well received and turned a profit was a big boost for the genre moving forward, paving the way for the likes of Young Guns and Lonesome Dove, which proved that there was still a significant appetite for westerns even in the 80s. So Pale Rider ended up having quite the legacy, eventually being nominated by the American Film Institute as one of the top 10 best Western films of all time. And you can even spot posters for the movie in other 80s films that wanted to pay tribute to it, such as Top Gun and National Lampoon's European Vacation. Clint Eastwood himself also capitalized on the buzz by launching his own beer brand called Pale Rider Ale. So another knock-on effect of the success of Pale Rider is that it's believed to have inspired the 2007 action thriller Missionary Man, starring Dolph Lundgren. And in the film, he plays a mysterious religious gunslinger who fights for justice for a group of Native Americans against a greedy developer who wants to force them off their land. But perhaps unsurprisingly, the movie was panned by critics and audiences alike, and would likely be all but forgotten nowadays if not for its striking similarity to Pale Rider. Now, a big reason why Pale Rider has been such an enduring success is because of its ambiguous, open-ended story, which offers just enough clues and hints for you to form theories about what's going on without ever truly confirming anything. And at the heart of this mystery is Clint Eastwood's character, the Preacher, who presents himself as a man of the cloth, despite clearly having a violent past and a score to settle, while also possessing powers that appear to verge on the supernatural. So this has led to lots of theories about his identity, with some of the most popular being that he's Death himself, an avenging angel, or perhaps even the stranger from High Plains Drifter. But Clint Eastwood did eventually open up about the true origin of the Preacher in an interview, saying,
"He's a reincarnation of a preacher who was killed by the force of evil, the marshal in the story."
So it would seem that the Preacher was in fact a ghost all along, which gives a whole new context to the movie, especially in regards to his seemingly superhuman abilities and his unspoken history with the character of Stockburn, who clearly recognizes the Preacher just before his death. So although Clint Eastwood had well and truly made his point that there was still an audience out there for westerns, after Pale Rider he decided to once again step away from the genre and pursue other projects, leading some to believe that Pale Rider was his last western. However, little did anybody know at the time that even while he was directing Pale Rider, Eastwood already knew for sure that he would be making another western, as he was secretly sitting on a script for one that he believed could be something really special, but required him to be an older age for it to truly resonate in the way that he felt it could. And this film was of course Unforgiven, a western that many still believe was his magnum opus as a director, and the perfect swan song for his career in this genre.
It's a hell of a thing, killing a man. You take away all he's got, and all he's ever gonna have.
Unforgiven started out as an original screenplay titled The William Money Killings, and it was written by an up-and-coming screenwriter called David Webb Peoples, who was apparently inspired to write the script upon reading the 1975 Western novel The Shootist, which was later adapted into a film starring John Wayne, in which he plays an aging gunslinger forced to confront his past, while reckoning with the influence he has on a younger man fascinated by his violent reputation. Peoples also took a lot of inspiration from Taxi Driver, especially in regards to its grounded approach to violence and death. However, once he finished the script for Unforgiven in 1976, it was not immediately picked up. Instead, his big break came when he was hired by Ridley Scott to rework the script for Blade Runner, before going on to co-write other films such as Ladyhawke and Leviathan. So sometime later, the script for Unforgiven was eventually optioned to be made into a film by the famous director Francis Ford Coppola, best known for The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. And upon acquiring the script, the director approached actor John Malkovich about playing the role of William Money. But Coppola was ultimately unable to raise the money required to develop the project, which in hindsight proved to be a blessing for Malkovich, who said, "I would have been a total failure. Who would have wanted to see that? I wouldn't." Now, following this failed attempt to get Unforgiven made, the script was eventually sent to Clint Eastwood, but it instead landed on the desk of his trusted associate Sonia Chernis, who previously worked on the story for the Outlaw Josey Wales. And after reading the script for Unforgiven, she made it very clear to Clint Eastwood just how much she hated it, criticizing it for its rough language and basic story, before sending a now infamous memo that read, "It really is an insult to this company which has always had high standards, even to accept a property like this, which isn't worth your time or my time. I can't think of one good thing to say about it, except maybe get rid of it fast." But luckily, Eastwood decided to ignore the memo and read the script anyway, immediately falling in love with it. So after acquiring the script for Unforgiven in the early 80s, Eastwood was keen to get the movie made, but he ultimately decided to put the script away in a drawer for the future and focus on other movies instead. And apparently, the reason for this was that although the script described the character of William Money as a man in his late 30s, Clint Eastwood felt that the story would make a lot more sense if the character was older. So he decided to wait until he was in his 60s before tackling the role. And in the meantime, he directed and starred in other popular westerns such as the Outlaw Josey Wales and Pale Rider, as well as numerous other movies. But the whole time, he knew that he had Unforgiven in his back pocket, saying, "It was kind of a little plum I was savouring. It's like you have something good on your plate, and you're saying, I'll eat this last." So it took until 1992 before Clint Eastwood finally decided to direct Unforgiven, returning to the genre that made him a star, following a series of box office disappointments, including The Rookie and Pink Cadillac. Now, ever since Clint Eastwood first read the script for Unforgiven, he'd always been quietly confident that the movie was going to be something special, and wanted a cast that would reflect that. So rather than going for reliable, lesser-known character actors like he'd done for most of his previous westerns, Eastwood instead went for big-name stars straight off the bat. So for the role of English Bob, Eastwood initially reached out to Jeremy Irons, but he turned him down. So he called Richard Harris to offer him the role instead, who just happened to be watching High Plains Drifter when Eastwood called, leading him to believe that it was a prank. But when Harris realised that it was genuine, he immediately said yes, later believing it to be fate. Meanwhile, around the same time, Morgan Freeman was filming Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves with Kevin Costner, who told him that there was a part in Unforgiven that he felt Freeman would be perfect for. So the actor reached out directly to Clint Eastwood about playing the character of Ned Logan, which Eastwood apparently felt was such a great fit that he didn't even consider anyone else. Likewise, actor Saul Rubinek also heard about Unforgiven while filming a romantic comedy called Man Trouble with Jack Nicholson, who apparently advised his co-star to make an extra effort to ensure his audition tape looked professional, which ended up being the thing that helped it stand out when Clint Eastwood eventually picked him. Now for the Schofield Kid, Eastwood did consider Sam Rockwell, but eventually opted for the relatively unknown TV actor James Woolvett, handing him the biggest role of his career to date. And for the role of Strawberry Alice, Clint Eastwood cast Frances Fisher, who happened to be dating at the time, before later having a daughter together called Francesca Eastwood, who just recently appeared in her father's latest film, Juror Number 2. Now, easily the most important casting in the movie was that of its main antagonist, Little Bill Daggett. And Eastwood was set on the late, great Gene Hackman for the role, but he'd actually already been approached about starring in the film by Francis Ford Coppola, and he just wasn't interested, as he felt he'd already taken on too many violent roles. But Eastwood insisted that Hackman reconsider, which he did, eventually coming round to the idea of playing a villainous lawman, as he felt that it was timely and important after the recent Rodney King incident, in which a black American was the victim of police brutality. And as a result of this change of heart, Gene Hackman absolutely stole the show as Daggett, even winning an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. Now, when it came to who should shoot the movie, in the past, Clint Eastwood would have typically called upon the services of cinematographer Bruce Surtees, who had shot all of his westerns from Joe Kidd through to Pale Rider. However, for Unforgiven, he decided to go with the cinematographer Jack N. Green, having previously worked together on Heartbreak Ridge, The Deadpool, and Pink Cadillac. And Green did an excellent job, using muted tones and natural light to invoke a richly atmospheric, gritty realism that really played into the themes of the movie. And as a result, Unforgiven was nominated for Best Cinematography at the Academy Awards. But since then, Green has turned his attention to shooting much more light-hearted films, such as 50 First Dates, 40-Year-Old Virgin, and Hot Tub Time Machine. Now, as for the score, Clint Eastwood hired composer Lenny Nyhorse, who'd met while serving in the US Army in the 1950s. And although he was only a jazz musician at the time, he later worked as a composer on Pale Rider, and an orchestrator on other westerns such as Chato's Land and Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. So Eastwood felt that he would be a perfect choice for Unforgiven, and their working relationship was so good that Nyhorse actually allowed Eastwood to compose the main theme himself, laying the foundation for them to work together again on numerous other movies, including Mystic River, $1 Million Baby, and Gran Torino. So despite Unforgiven being one of the most famous American westerns of all time, it was actually shot entirely in Canada, even though that was never originally the plan. And this was apparently all because of its cinematographer Jack N. Green, who while working on other films in Canada, was asked by an official from their filmmaking union why Clint Eastwood had never once shot a movie in the country. So Green explained that whenever Clint Eastwood makes a film, he always uses the same loyal crew behind the scenes, which wouldn't be possible in Canada, as shooting in a foreign country usually requires the director to hire locals. So after hearing this, the Canadian Union offered Eastwood a deal, in which they would waive the normal work rules and allow him to use his own crew members, as long as they had already worked with him on at least 5 movies, which all of his team had. As a result, Unforgiven was ultimately filmed in Alberta, Canada, 60 miles away from the nearest city, providing the film with picturesque sweeping prairies and untouched landscapes that really added to the visual identity of the movie. Another advantage of shooting in Canada was that there was plenty of room for the fictional town of Big Whiskey. And just like with High Plains Drifter, Clint Eastwood insisted on building a full-scale western town, complete with no false fronts and totally authentic interiors, which all in all ended up taking 32 days to construct. So given how much effort Clint Eastwood was putting into making Unforgiven feel like an authentic western, he decided to go one step further by banning all motorized vehicles on set. And the main reason for this was to avoid any anachronistic tire tracks making it into the final film. But Eastwood also believed it would be a good way of psychologically locking his cast and crew into the time period, actively encouraging them to use horses and wagons instead of cars. So one big disadvantage of shooting in Alberta is that it was an area prone to unpredictable weather, especially rain and flash flooding. But ironically, Unforgiven was filming during a rare dry period, meaning that Clint Eastwood was forced to fake the dramatic rainstorm that features at the climax of the movie. There was also an unexpected snowstorm that hit the area towards the end of the shoot, which Eastwood smartly decided to make the most of, featuring the snowfall in the scene where Money's recovering from his wounds. So once Clint Eastwood finally finished the film, he felt compelled to dedicate it to Sergio and Don. This of course referred to the famous directors Sergio Leone and Don Siegel, with the latter having passed away just months before production started on Unforgiven. And the reason Eastwood felt the need to pay tribute to them in this way was because he viewed them as his biggest filmmaking mentors, who between them provided him with his most iconic roles as the Man with No Name and Dirty Harry. It also proved fitting in that Unforgiven was the first movie that Clint Eastwood had directed that was universally regarded as a masterpiece, cementing his reputation as a director who was now just as talented as the pair that he learned his craft from. Now once Unforgiven was complete, the finished film was presented 4 days ahead of schedule to Warner Brothers, who were delighted with how the movie had turned out. But apparently there were discussions internally between executives about the idea of slightly trimming its runtime. However, the problem was that nobody had the nerve to broach the topic to Eastwood, out of fear of how he might react. So in the end, Unforgiven remained uncut, with a runtime of 2 hours and 11 minutes. So as much as Clint Eastwood loved the original script for Unforgiven, he'd never actually got a chance to meet its writer David Webb Peoples. So Eastwood decided to invite the screenwriter to the studio to watch the final film, and when he arrived, he made the decision to sit away from Eastwood during the screening, so that the director couldn't see his face, as he was genuinely worried about how his script had been adapted. But upon watching the film, he realised that he need not have worried, as he was amazed with what Eastwood had done with the script, saying, "Without changing a word, Clint made the script tougher, more uncompromising, without slickness, and the heart was still in it. If there was ever a picture that belonged to its director, it's Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven." So when it came time to release Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood insisted on a low-key pre-release campaign for the movie, as he was apparently confident enough in its quality that he felt it would naturally find an audience. He also wanted people that did go to see it to come away from the cinema with a sense of discovery, so as to encourage word-of-mouth buzz. So following a summer of blockbusters including Batman Returns, Sister Act and Lethal Weapon 3, Unforgiven hit cinemas in August 1992 with very little fanfare. However, it ended up having one of the highest August opening weekends of any film up to that point, performing better than any Clint Eastwood film that had come before, ultimately grossing $159.2 million on a budget of just $14.4 million. Now, despite its box office success and popularity with general audiences, critics were generally more undecided about the movie. For instance, Hal Hinson of the Washington Post said, "By now, Eastwood has little more than a paint-by-numbers approach to acting. As a result, we relate to Money more as a compendium of Eastwood's earlier characters." But easily Unforgiven's most famous detractors were the well-respected critics Robert Ebert and Gene Siskel, who said,
"I thought that the picture really was overdrawn, and then I couldn't understand some of the characters, why they were stuffed in there. The Richard Harris character isn't really necessary at all. It could have been more of a showdown with Heckman and Eastwood. I wanted Eastwood's character to be enlarged, frankly. I thought he was sort of small within the picture, and great looking to be sure, but lifeless."
Now, in fairness, to their credit, they did eventually re-evaluate the movie, as Robert Ebert later praised the movie in the Chicago Sun-Times, saying, "It has the elements of a crime picture, but the freedom of an art film. Unforgiven uses a genre as a way to study human nature. That implacable moral balance in which good eventually silences evil is at the heart of the Western, and Eastwood is not shy about saying so." So nowadays, Unforgiven is universally adored by critics and audiences alike, and viewed by many to be Clint Eastwood's finest achievement as both a director and an actor. Now, following the critical and commercial success of Unforgiven, the movie slowly but surely became an unlikely awards contender. And the reason it was unlikely was because westerns were typically overlooked in that regard. And despite his long, memorable career in cinema, Clint Eastwood had never so much as been nominated for an Oscar, leading him to believe that he would never win one. But that all changed with Unforgiven, as it was nominated in 9 categories at the 65th Academy Awards, winning Oscars for Best Picture, Director, Supporting Actor, and Film Editing. So not only was Unforgiven the first Clint Eastwood movie to win an Oscar, but it was also the third Western in history to ever win Best Picture, alongside Cimarron and Dances with Wolves. So over 20 years after the release of Unforgiven, the iconic Western got an unexpected Japanese-language remake starring Ken Watanabe, which essentially transported the plot into a samurai movie set in post-feudal Japan. Yet despite this, the movie manages to retain the tone and moral complexity of the original, while hitting most of the same story beats, and at times even recreating shots from Unforgiven. So the movie went down really well with critics and audiences alike, boasting beautiful cinematography and excellent performances. It also proved to be a fitting full-circle moment, in that Clint Eastwood would never have risen to stardom in the Western genre if not for his breakout role in A Fistful of Dollars, which was famously an unofficial remake of a Japanese samurai movie called Yojimbo. So given all the themes of aging and redemption that Unforgiven explores, many naturally assumed that the movie was intended to be Clint Eastwood's final Western. But that wasn't necessarily the case, because at no point during its production did Eastwood consciously view the film as his farewell to the genre, although, on reflection, he conceded that if he were to try and make another Western, it would likely end up being either a rehash of previous plotlines or an imitation of someone else's work, leading him to say that if there is going to be a last one, this is a perfect one. So outside of his 2021 neo-Western Cry Macho, Clint Eastwood has never properly returned to the Western genre, despite continuing to act and direct well into his 90s. But this restraint has only made Unforgiven feel all the more significant, as Eastwood managed to leave the genre on an all-time high, ultimately respecting the fact that Unforgiven was the perfect conclusion to his legendary career in a genre that he'll forever be the face of. But let me know below, do you think he should have made another Western, or was Unforgiven really the perfect ending? And if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and it would be massively appreciated if you could leave the video a like. Also, if you're a fan of Clint Eastwood, you might want to check out this video right here.